you can't see all of it. Wait. Okay. Is it on? Okay. This is the transitional security arrangements in the UN Charter, an article that has been misunderstood, beziehungsweise misinterpreted, beziehungsweise not understood at all, and it has a history even before the First World War. The Austrian Nobel Peace Laureate Alfred Hermann Fried talked about a transition that after the end of the war, one should not return to the state before the war, with each country having its individual military establishments, but there should be a transition to an international peace based on justice and order, an international order. Here, very clear, you can see that if it is difficult to understand and complicated because of the references, etc., but very clear is one thing here, that so far, after nearly 70 years, the Security Council has not even begun to exercise its responsibilities. Right? I think that is one thing that is very clear. The permanent members of the Security Council can act. They can do anything, just whatever they like. The Security Council is a law unto itself. There is no statute or no rules or regulations. Even a coalition of the willing can act, trying to use the United Nations as a kind of legitimating background. The 5 permanent members can act without the mantle of legitimacy of the Security Council. So this is very important to understand as an introduction to what I'm actually going to say. And very interesting, and in order to understand Article 106, what is actually meant and what was the work that went into the making of Article 106, is this work by the Commission to Study the Organization of Peace, and especially the second report, the transitional period. And I urge you all to read, especially one of the main papers in this publication, which I have. I don't know if it is still available in audiobooks or something, by Professor Quincy Wright of Chicago University, very well known among students of international relations and peace studies. And I put this online. You can even search within the text. It's not just a scanned document, but in the text you can search. And this will give you a complete understanding of what is meant by this Article 106. And this is very interesting. So the UN Charter is not a final document. Now let me see. And where is it? And here you see also not all of it. Well, this is the article which is online by Professor Quincy Wright on the political conditions of the period of transition. Yeah, so here you can, if you just read some of this, you can understand what this is about. And it's basically a new concept in international law that was introduced by the victorious powers, no doubt, who are more or less the same as those powers who already at the Hague Peace Conferences in 1899 and 1907 were in favor of the world order that was under discussion there, and who then created the League of Nations and also the United Nations. Here we have another quote, the transitional period, etc., etc. So now I'm thinking whether to read from the paper or whether to read from the screen of my computer. So this subject is very intriguing and puzzling and has engaged me for some time, and I think may have some important consequences for the future of peace. As is well known among peace historians, at the Hague Peace Conference in 1899 and 1907, which I just mentioned, when the nations represented voted on the International Court, Germany voted against it. 40 years later, in the new German constitution, and actually I think I will have to show you this here. The new German constitution, this mistake made at The Hague was acknowledged, and an obligation entered into our constitution to submit to the ICJ's compulsory jurisdiction, join a system of collective security, and never again take part in aggressive war. The new constitution, which Germany adopted in May 1949, contained no provisions relating to the military, a defense ministry, or declaring a state of war. Instead, it provided for delegating what Jan Tinbergen once in a letter to me called security sovereignty to the United Nations, supposedly with the aim of facilitating or initiating the transition to collective security and disarming to the minimum stipulated in Article 26 of the UN Charter. So here you have the article in Germany, which was at the Constitutional Convention, the German Social Democrat Professor Klaus Schlichtmann signed responsible for this, and he thought of the United Nations, that the Federation may by law transfer by a bill in Parliament with a simple majority, transfer sovereign powers to the United Nations. That's what he thought. So it appears that delegating security sovereignty to the UN was designed to start the process of the transition to collective security stipulated in Article 106 of the UN Charter. Now let's take a look at the history of the events leading up to the year 1950. Actually, in my introduction, I should have said, already referred to the fact that the Russians in 1950 said that they could only participate in the collective action by the United Nations against the aggression of the North under Kim Il-sung if the transitional security arrangements would be implemented. In 1946, well, there's a lot of history, maybe I tried to do it very fast. After the end of World War II and the creation of the United Nations as successor to the League of Nations and the Hague Confederation of States, France adopted a new constitution agreeing on condition of reciprocity, probably aimed at Germany, to limitations of its national sovereignty in favor of the organization and defense of the open. Okay? So it made clear that the organization and defense of peace required ceding certain sovereign powers to the international organization. The condition of reciprocity is stipulated and the German Constitution, Article 24, which we have here, actually was based on the French precedent. Carl Schmitt was a Francophone I think she translated Baudelaire also. And so there was a general surge towards world organization worldwide. And you're probably familiar with George Kennan's long telegram to the US Secretary of State in February 1946, sort of discrediting the Soviet Union, that it had no devotion to UNO ideals. Probably that it was quite wrong. Kennan, known as the father of containment, had begun studying Russian in 1928, etc., and developed strong anti-Soviet sentiments. And there's a quote here, I don't know if you want to see this. One telegram. And then there was the Iron Curtain speech of Winston Churchill, which on rereading made quite, he emphasized that the UNO, as successor of the League of Nations, must make sure that its work is fruitful. Churchill demanded that the UNO must immediately begin to be equipped with an international armed force for the service of the world organization. He warned of the possibility of German aggression. He said something nice about the Russians. And so now, did Churchill, the Fabian socialist, see communism as a threat? I don't know. In May 1947, the Japanese constitution went into effect, denouncing the right of belligerency and limiting national sovereignty. The only nation, maybe Costa Rica as well, the only nation that has already limited its national sovereignty, aiming at an international peace based on justice and order. Then there was Ernest Bevin calling for the establishment of a directly elected world parliament. When in June 1947 all the German prime ministers from the 4 occupied zones met in Munich, this was the chance that the Germans themselves would agree to create a unified state. However, the Munich conference failed to reconcile divergent views, apparently without having touched upon international issues related to the UN. And from that time on, the US military favored German rearmament, but the State Department rejected the idea that the time had come to press for German rearmament. In fact, it called for a truly international force, the State Department. So, however, in Germany, even after the end of the Second World War, German realpolitik continued primarily along the lines of the Hegelian concept of power politics, which countered the idea of an internationalistic organization of peace with skepticism. Then there's this letter of Einstein writing to the General Assembly of the United Nations, which the Russians at that time rejected. One wonders why. Then the Italian constitution, also with a condition of reciprocity, went into effect in 1948. Yeah, I'm summarizing. And German inaction, not even verbally empowering or even acknowledging the United Nations, led to further division and confrontation. I'm saying something about Clarence Strike's book, which George Orwell criticized very much, because he said even that in the colonies the people would continue to be underprivileged. And of course, a union of only the democracies was out of question. China could not be left out. In India, Gandhi had said early on, even after World War I already, he had stressed that he would welcome a world federation, and that a federation of the Western nations only would be an unholy combination and a menace to humanity. Now we come to the Korean crisis. Since aggressive war had been outlawed by the 1928 Pact of Paris, legally the action of the Allies against Germany and the Axis powers was not war, but law enforcement, with the United Nations acting as a police force to suppress assaults on basic principles of international order, as Prince Wright in that paper, which I put online, had put it. The term United Nations stems, of course, as you all know, from the Declaration of the United Nations issued in January 1942 by the United States, the USSR, the UK, China, and 22 more countries. Now we come to Korea. In 1943, the Allies agreed that Korea was to be free and independent. Ending the war, the Soviet Union occupied the north, while the United States was disarming the Japanese in the south. By 1948, the Russians had left North Korea. The Russians, therefore, refused to sign a separate friendship and cooperation treaty with North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, believing that a unified Korea was essentially impossible. So then the Korean War began on 25th June 1950, and the narrative presented until the end of the Cold War had been that the North Korean invasion was a Soviet plan, But after the opening of the archives in the former Soviet Union's foreign ministry, documentary evidence shows quite a different picture. Stalin did not want to attack the South. So who were the scaremongers and Nazi sympathizers in the Pentagon and their German counterparts who were consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally spurring each other on, spreading fear of communism in Europe and elsewhere, which in turn prompted Germany to beat the war drums once again? I'm skipping something here. You can read, of course. And a statement issued by the Department of State's Office of Intelligence Research insisted there was no increased threat or change in military capabilities of the USSR, etc., etc. You can read about NSC 68, this National Security Council report. You can also ask me for the paper, I will send it to you. And Nietzsche, who was this Nazi sympathizer, apparently, who finally got his wish, the Cold War. And it was the Germans, this is my thesis, it was the Germans who had given him the space. John McCloy, who later was instrumental in drafting the McCloy-Zorin Accords of 1961, on which Kennedy commented and which were unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly on 20th December 1961, was active at that time in Germany. He was also telling the Germans not to get too excited and rejected this German position. So I should come to the final conclusion is now, and for that I think it would be quite enough to just show you what is also online. You can also see this online. The Russian, this is the historic record, which really is still mystifying to me. You know, the Russians apparently said that we can only participate, as I said in the beginning, in this UN action in Korea if the transitional security arrangements are implemented. And I have written to Gorbachev, in Moscow, I have written to, what's her name, Nina Khrushcheva in New York. I have asked them, I have written to RT also, did the Russians at that time, they must have known the German constitution, that there was a new German constitution aiming at collective security, right? And the Russians, as far as I know, traditionally, even before World War II, had been in favor of collective security. So did the Russians speculate or hope or maybe even expect that Germany would take action to trigger the transition by transferring security sovereignty to the United Nations Security Council? I think yes. I think if Gorbachev has not answered, I think this is agreeing with, basically. Vitace consentiro videtur, and also Gorbachev. I think the Russians knew. They were speculating. Maybe it was just politicking, as I say in my paper. Maybe it was just that the Russians wanted more space for their communist activities. If you would have this real disarmament and collective security, that would give the Russians, the communists, more space for their activities. I don't know, you know. But the fact is that they said, and it is documented, and it is online. Here, note 55, you can see. Yeah, online. Online. This is the statement taking into account the particular importance of concerted action by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council in defending and strengthening peace and security among nations, recommends that before armed forces are placed at the disposal of the Security Council under appropriate agreements concluded in accordance with Article 43 of the Charter, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council should take steps to ensure the necessary implementation of Article 106 of the Charter for the purpose of taking such joint action on behalf of the organization as may prove to be necessary for the maintenance of international peace and security. Now, here there is a question, there is a problem. How can the 5 permanent members take steps to ensure implementation of Article 106? Actually, they cannot. National lawgivers, like Germany under Article 24, can take action to trigger the process of the transition.